In the year 1856, on a dusty plain in what is now Pakistan, a British railroad worker swings his pickaxe into the ground. He is laying track for a line that will one day connect Karachi to Lahore. The empire is hungry. The empire needs steel and stone and ballast, millions of bricks to keep the rails from sinking. His pickaxe strikes something hard. He kneels down, brushes the dirt away, and pulls out a single perfectly fired brick. It is too perfect, too uniform, too old. What he is holding is not a brick from some forgotten Mughal village or a fallen British outpost. What he is holding is a brick that was fired 5,000 years ago. A brick from a city older than Egypt. A brick from a civilization the world had completely forgotten existed. And over the next several months, he and his crew will pull tens of thousands more out of the ground. And they will use them without a second thought to lay 150 kilometers of railway track on top of the bones of a lost super civilization. This is the story of the people who made that brick. They had running water before Europeans had wheels. They had standardized weights before the Greeks had philosophy. They built the world's first planned megacities, and then, one day, they vanished. Their writing has never been deciphered. Their language is unknown. Their kings have no names. And yet, you carry pieces of their civilization in your home, in your language, in your blood, right now. This is episode 1 of the longest, strangest, most magnificent civilizational story on earth. This is the story of India. Section 1. What the world forgot. For most of modern history, the world told one story about ancient civilization. It started in Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates. It moved to Egypt along the Nile. It blossomed in Greece, conquered with Rome, and then eventually marched east to discover India. That is the story Europe wrote. That is the story school textbooks repeated for 200 years. And it is wrong. Because while Egypt was still raising its first dynasty, while Mesopotamia was still drawing its first city walls, a third civilization, far bigger than either of them, was already running on the banks of a river system in northwest India. It covered an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, more than 1 million square kilometers. From Afghanistan in the west to the Yamuna River in the east, from the Himalayas in the north, all the way down to the Arabian Sea. We call it the Indus Valley Civilization, or more accurately, the Harappan civilization, named after the very first of its cities to be excavated. But the people who lived there had no idea they would one day be called that. They had their own names for themselves. We just don't know what those names were. Because their script, the one they carved into thousands of seals and tablets and pots, has never been read. Not by us, not by anyone. It is one of the great unsolved puzzles of human history. But what we do know about them, what archaeology has carefully pried from the dirt over the last 100 years, is so extraordinary that it forces a complete rewrite of what ancient even means. So let's go back, all the way back, 5,000 years. The story really begins around 7000 BC in a place called Mehergarh in modern-day Balochistan. Farmers there are domesticating wheat, barley, and cattle. They are firing pottery. They are building mud brick homes. Over the next 4,000 years, these people slowly, patiently build up the foundations of urban life. They master irrigation. They learn to bake bricks at uniform temperatures. They develop trade networks that stretch into Central Asia. And then, somewhere around 2600 BCE, something incredible happens. Cities explode out of the ground. Not villages, not towns. Cities, planned, gridded, engineered cities that would not look out of place in a 19th century map of London. The two most famous of these are Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, both in modern Pakistan today. But here is what the textbooks often leave out. And here is something every Indian listener needs to hear. The largest Indus city ever found is not in Pakistan. It is in India. It is called Rakhigarh. It sits in Hisar district in the state of Haryana, about 150 kilometers from Delhi. And in 2014, after decades of careful remapping by the Archaeological Survey of India, archaeologists confirmed that Rakhigarh covers a staggering 350 hectares, overtaking Mohenjo-daro by 50 hectares to become the largest known site of the entire Indus Valley civilization. For comparison, Mohenjo-daro at its peak housed around 40,000 people. The full civilization across hundreds of cities and towns may have supported between 1 and 5 million people. 5 million. 5 million in an era when most of humanity still lived in scattered tribal villages. And these were not crude settlements. They were obsessively, almost compulsively planned. Walk through Mohenjo-daro, even today, and you walk through a perfect grid. The main streets run dead north to south. The cross streets run dead east to west. The blocks are rectangular. The houses are aligned. There is a kind of citadel on the western side, a lower city to the east. Every neighborhood has a well. Every house has a bathing area. Every street has a covered drain running under it. Yes, you heard that right. A covered drain, a sewer system, in every single street 5,000 years ago. When the Roman emperors built the famous Cloaca Maxima in Rome, they were considered geniuses ahead of their time. The Cloaca Maxima was built around 600 BCE. The drains of Mohenjo-daro are 2,000 years old. Inside the homes, archaeologists have found something even more astonishing, what appear to be the world's first flush toilets. Brick-lined chutes that fed waste directly into the city's drainage network. Not in palaces, not in temples, in ordinary middle-class homes. In the West, this level of indoor plumbing would not be common again until somewhere around the 1850s of our current era. 3,500 years after the Indus people were already doing it. You begin to understand now why archaeologists call these the most underrated civilization in human history. So how did all of this stay hidden for so long? The answer is, in a strange way, the same brick that started this episode. Travelers had been noticing the ruins of Harappa for decades. In 1842, a British adventurer named Charles Masson wrote about a strange brick mound in the Punjab that he believed was the ruin of an ancient city. Local villagers told him the same thing. They had been pulling bricks out of that mound for generations. They used them to build their homes. But no one in the colonial establishment took it seriously. The British were obsessed with the idea that civilization in India had begun with the Aryans, or the Greeks, or the Mughals, anyone, really, except the Indians themselves. So when those railway workers in 1856 began ripping bricks out of the ground to lay the Karachi-Lahore line, no one stopped them. The Brunton brothers, John and William, were the engineers in charge. They reported that they had found an excellent source of building material in the form of an ancient mound, and they used those bricks to lay 150 kilometers of railway ballast. 150 kilometers of an unknown civilization, crushed and buried under iron tracks, erased so a colonial railway could run more efficiently. It would take another 60 years before anyone realized what had been destroyed. In 1921 and 1922, Sir John Marshall, the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, finally launched a serious dig at Harappa and then at Mohenjo-daro. And what came out of the ground stunned the world. This was not a footnote. This was not a regional curiosity. This was a third great river valley civilization, older than anything in Greek or Roman memory, comparable in age and scale to Egypt and Mesopotamia, sitting right under the feet of British India. And the British had been using its bones for railway ballast. If you want a single image to summarize the colonial experience of India, you could do worse than that. But the story of who these people actually were is even stranger than the story of how they were lost. Here is something genuinely strange about the Indus Valley civilization. We have no kings. In Egypt, every excavation eventually surrenders a pharaoh, a name, a tomb. In Mesopotamia, you cannot dig for a season without finding the king list of Ur or the ziggurat of some divine ruler. In the Indus Valley, nothing. No royal palaces, no giant temples, no statues of conquering monarchs, no tombs stuffed with gold and slaves. After 100 years of excavation across hundreds of sites, archaeologists have not found a single confirmed king. This is so unusual that scholars have started to seriously ask a question that, a generation ago, would have sounded ridiculous. What if the Indus people did not have kings? What if they were governed by councils, by guilds, by priestly assemblies? What if the entire society, 5 million people, hundreds of cities, a unified system of weights and measures across 1 million square kilometers, was running not on the orders of a god king, but on something closer to a shared civic culture? We do not know. We cannot know until we crack their script. But the evidence keeps piling up that this was a society obsessed with two things: standardization and equality. Their bricks in every city are made to the exact same ratio, 1 to 2 to 4. A small Indus brick from Lothal in Gujarat will fit perfectly into a wall in Harappa, 1500 kilometers away. Their weights are calibrated on a binary system, accurate to a fraction of a gram, identical from Afghanistan to the Indian Ocean. Their houses, even the largest ones, are not dramatically bigger than the smaller ones. There is no Versailles. There is no Pyramid of Giza. The biggest single building ever found in Mohenjo-daro is something archaeologists call the Great Bath, a brick-lined pool, 12 meters long, sealed against leaks with bitumen, almost certainly a public ritual space, not a private palace. Compare this to the contemporary world. While Mohenjo-daro is building public swimming pools, the pharaohs of Egypt are conscripting tens of thousands of slaves to drag stones into the desert so they can be buried with their gold. While the kings of Akkad are recording their conquest in cuneiform, I crushed this city, I impaled these prisoners, I am the lord of the four corners of the world. The people of Harappa are recording, as far as we can tell, mostly inventories, trade records, numbers, names of goods. There is, so far, almost no martial art, almost no glorification of war. Very few weapons that look genuinely military, no mass graves, no fortifications that look like they were ever attacked. For a civilization that lasted nearly 2000 years, that is breathtaking. It is, of course, possible we are missing something. It is possible script, when finally read, will reveal kings and conquests and tyrants we cannot yet see. But for now, the Indus Valley stands out as one of the most peaceful, equal, and well-organized urban societies the ancient world ever produced. If you really want to feel the scale of what these people pulled off, you have to go to a small site in modern Gujarat, on the western coast of India, a site called Lothal. Lothal does not look like much from a distance. A low mound, some baked brick foundations, a few tourist signs, but walk to its eastern edge, and you find yourself standing on the rim of an enormous brick-lined basin, about 220 meters long, more than 35 meters wide, with carefully engineered inflow and outflow channels. Most archaeologists believe this was a dockyard, the world's first dockyard, a tide-managed, brick-engineered, sea-going port built around 2400 BCE. Lothal was where Indus traders loaded their ships with cotton textiles, beads, ivory, and timber, and sent them across the Arabian Sea to Oman, to Bahrain, to the great city of Ur in Mesopotamia. We are not guessing. We have the proof. on the other end. Sumerian and Akkadian tablets from this period repeatedly mention a far-off exotic land they call Meluha, and almost every serious scholar today identifies Meluha as the Indus Valley. The tablets describe Meluhan ships docking in Mesopotamian ports. They describe Meluhan goods, carnelian beads, hardwoods, peacocks flooding into Mesopotamian markets. They describe Meluhan merchants who lived in their own neighborhoods in cities like Pur with their own translators. So picture this. Around 4,400 years ago, an Indian merchant from a city in Gujarat sails across the Arabian Sea, walks into a port in modern-day Iraq, sets up shop in a foreign neighborhood, and trades carnelian beads from Khambhat for Mesopotamian silver. That is the world that was already running while Stonehenge was still being built. And that is the world that somewhere around 1900 BCE began to fall apart. The fall of the Indus Valley civilization is one of the great unsolved mysteries of archaeology. And for most of the 20th century, it had a very simple answer. That answer was invaders. The story, originally proposed by British colonial historians in the 1920s and 1930s, went like this. Around 1500 BCE, light-skinned horse-riding warriors from Central Asia, the so-called Aryans, came thundering down into the subcontinent, smashed the dark-skinned Indus people, burned their cities, and replaced them with a new culture that produced the Vedas, Sanskrit, and Hinduism. This is the famous Aryan invasion theory. And here is the truth. That theory in that form is dead. Modern archaeology has found no evidence, none, of mass violence, mass burning, or sudden military destruction at any major Indus site. The skeletons people once pointed to as massacre victims have been re-examined, and the wounds are not battle wounds. The cities were not burned down by an army. They were slowly, gradually abandoned over a period of centuries. So if it was not invasion, what was it? The most widely accepted answer today is, painfully, the most modern one, climate change. Around 2200 BCE, the entire ancient world entered a long, dry, terrifying climatic shift. Monsoons weakened, rivers shrank. Summer, the Egyptian Old Kingdom collapsed. The Akkadian Empire fell. The cities of the Indus, dependent on the monsoon and on a network of rivers, started to die from the inside. There is one river in particular that haunts this story. Indian tradition remembers it as the Saraswati, the great mother river of the Rig Veda, said to flow from the mountains to the sea. Modern satellite imagery and geological surveys have now confirmed that there really was a massive river system running roughly along what Indian tradition called the Saraswati's path, through what is now the Ghaggar Hakra dry channel in Haryana and Rajasthan. And around the 2nd millennium BCE, that river system began to weaken, shift, and ultimately go almost dry. The single largest concentration of Indus Valley sites, including Rakhigarhi itself, sits along the banks of that lost river. Imagine what that meant. Imagine being a citizen of one of those great cities, watching the river that fed your fields shrink year after year, generation after generation. Watching your harvests fail, watching your trade partners in Mesopotamia stop sending ships because their world is collapsing too. The cities did not fall in fire and blood. They fell in silence and dust and migration. The people did not die. They moved. They moved south. They moved east. They moved into the Ganga plains, into Gujarat, into the Deccan, into the Tamil south. They carried their crafts, their genes, their gods, and probably much of their language with them. And modern genetic studies of South Asian populations published in the last decade confirm something extraordinary. The Indus Valley people are not a vast tribe. They are us. Their DNA flows in modern Indian populations from Punjab to Tamil Nadu. Their ideas, their fascination with bathing, their obsession with cleanliness, their bull and yogi-like seal imagery echo through the ritual life of every Indian today. The Indus civilization did not end, it scattered, and in scattering, it seeded the next great chapter of Indian history.
Asato ma sadgamaya.
Around the same time the Indus cities were drying out, another story begins to enter the Indian subcontinent. This is where things get controversial, so I want to handle this carefully because it matters. According to the dominant endemic theory today, based on linguistics, archaeology, and an increasing body of ancient DNA evidence, small groups of Indo-European speaking peoples, often called Indo-Aryans, began moving into northwest India from the Central Asian steppes, sometime between 2000 and 1500 BCE. Note the word moving, not invading. The old Aryan invasion theory, with its galloping war chariots and burning cities, is rejected by mainstream scholarship. What the evidence supports today is a slow, complex migration, small bands of pastoralists trickling in over centuries, intermarrying, exchanging culture, and gradually shaping a new synthesis with the late Indus people who were already there. There is also a school of thought, particularly strong among many Indian scholars, that argues for the so-called indigenous Aryan theory or out of India theory, that the Vedic culture grew naturally and continuously out of the Indus Valley itself, with no significant outside migration at all. This view is not the international academic mainstream, but it is a serious and ongoing scholarly debate, and one that genuinely matters for how Indians understand their own civilizational continuity. What both views share, and this is the important part, is a recognition that the Vedic age is not a foreign imposition on India. It is woven intimately and inseparably into the long fabric of Indian history. And what an age it was. By around 1500 BCE, in the river valleys of the Punjab and the Upper Ganga, a remarkable society begins to take shape. They call themselves Arya, a word that, in their language, means noble or honorable. They speak a language we now call Vedic Sanskrit, the ancestor of half the languages of modern North India. And they produce over the next several centuries a body of sacred poetry so vast, so complex, and so memorized that it survives orally, word for word, syllable for syllable, for nearly 3000 years before anyone writes it down. These are the Vedas. 4 of them, the Rig Veda, the Yajur Veda, the Sama Veda, and the Atharva Veda. The oldest, the Rig Veda, is a collection of more than 1,000 hymns to the gods of the Vedic world. Indra, the warrior god of storms; Agni, the god of fire who carries human prayers up to the heavens; Varuna, the god of cosmic order; and Saraswati, the river goddess who, by the time the hymns are composed, is already half memory and half myth. These hymns are not just religious literature, they are time capsules. They preserve, embedded in their poetry, glimpses of an entire society, a world of cattle-herding tribes, of horse sacrifices, of family priests, of rivalries between clans called the Bharatas and the Purus, of kings who hold great fire ceremonies to legitimize their rule. It is from the Bharatas, by the way, one of those Vedic tribes, that the modern Indian Republic takes its constitutional name, Bharat. The official name of India in the Indian Constitution is Bharatgarja, the Republic of the Bharatas, a tribal name from the Rig Veda carried directly through 3000 years into the 21st century. That is the kind of civilizational continuity we are talking about. The Vedic age did not give us only hymns. It gave us, for better and for worse, the early outline of a social order that would shape India for the next 3000 years. The Rig Veda contains a famous, late and deeply important hymn called the Purusha Sukta. In it, the cosmos is described as having been created from the body of a primordial being called Purusha. From his mouth came the Brahmins, the priests and teachers. From his arms came the Kshatriyas, the warriors and rulers. From his thighs came the Vaishyas, the farmers and merchants. And from his feet came the Shudras, the laborers and servants. This is the original blueprint of what would later become the caste system, or more precisely, the Varna system. It is important to understand a few things about it. First, in the early Vedic period, Varna was not the rigid, birth-locked, untouchable creating caste system of later centuries. The Vedas themselves describe people changing Varna based on profession and conduct. A son of a priest could become a warrior. A wise warrior could become a teacher. Second, the system that the world now associates with the word caste, with thousands of jati or sub-communities, with strict birth rules, with the cruel category of untouchability, that system hardened over many later centuries, through medieval and colonial periods, into something the Vedic texts themselves would scarcely recognize. And third, India is the only major civilization in the world that has a continuous internal philosophical tradition, including within Hinduism itself, of saints, reformers, and revolutionaries who have argued, sometimes ferociously, against caste hierarchy. From the Buddha and Mahavira in the 6th century BCE to the medieval Bhakti saints, to Guru Nanak, to Jyotirao Phule, to B.R. Ambedkar, the Vedic age planted the seed of a hierarchy that would grow into something painful and unjust. But it also, in the same soil, planted a tradition of self-questioning that has produced some of the most powerful spiritual and ethical movements in human history. A dual inheritance, the order and the rebellion against the order, is one of the deepest grooves in the Indian civilizational mind. It is older than the Roman Empire. It is older than written Chinese history. And it is still alive in Indian politics, in Indian families, in Indian dinner table arguments today. By around 1000 BCE, the Vedic people are no longer just nomads in the Punjab. They have crossed the Yamuna. They have settled into the Great Ganga Plain. They have learned to work iron, a transformative technology that lets them clear the dense forests of the central subcontinent and turn them into farmland. Cities, real cities, the first big urban centers since the Indus collapse, start to rise again. The first kingdoms begin to form. They are called Janapadas, literally the footholds of the people. And in time, 16 of them will grow into great states that historians call the Mahajanapadas. In one of those Mahajanapadas, in a kingdom called Magadha, a young prince will one day be born to a wealthy clan in the Himalayan foothills. He will be raised in a palace. He will be sheltered from the sight of suffering until the day he isn't. And when he finally walks out of that palace and sees an old man, a sick man, and a dead body, three things he has never seen before. He will be so shaken that he will give up his throne, sit beneath a fig tree in a place we now call Bodh Gaya, and after 49 days of meditation, he will achieve something the world had never quite seen before. His name will be Siddhartha Gautama. The world will remember him as the Buddha. Around the same time, another Indian prince, this one named Vardhamana, will renounce his own throne and walk naked into the wilderness to teach a doctrine of absolute non-violence so radical that it will give the world the very word, ahimsa, that Mahatma Gandhi will use 2500 years later to bring down the British Empire. And rising above all of them, out of that same Magadha soil, will come the man who will unite, for the very first time in history, almost the entire Indian subcontinent under a single throne. A man whose name still echoes in every village in India. A man who will turn his back on conquest at the moment of his greatest victory and try, really, genuinely try, to build the world's first non-violent empire. His name will be Ashoka. And his story is where this series goes next. If this is the start of your journey into Indian history, I want you to take one thing away from this episode. When somebody tells you that India is an old country, they are radically understating the case. India is not an old country. India is a civilizational continuity longer than any other unbroken human story on earth. The brick that the British railway worker pulled out of the dirt in 1856 was not from a different country. It was from the same country he was standing in, from the same people, from the same civilization that 5,000 years later still calls itself Bharat, after a tribe in the Rig Veda. That is the story we are telling episode by episode. If that hit you, hit subscribe. Tell me in the comments, do you trace your family back to one of the regions we talked about today? Punjab, Sindh, Gujarat, Haryana, Tamil Nadu. I read every single one. In the next episode, we walk into the rise of Magadha, the Buddha's first sermon, and the man who built India's first true empire. His name was Ashoka. And the story of how he conquered everything and then chose to lose it all on purpose is one of the strangest, most powerful stories ever told. I will see you there.